Hi, I'm Amy Roadman, a teaching artist with the Southern Alleghenies Museum of Art and the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. Today's lesson is about watercolor paper and the importance of actually investing in quality. So I have several types of paper in front of me. The first one is a large sheet of multimedia paper. So you can buy it in a large pad, just, at any store, including Walmart, not just art stores. And there's 60 sheets in the pad, so you have a lot. It can rip out easily, but it is only 98 pounds, meaning it's pretty thin, it's very flexible, and it's best if you actually prepare your paper before you start painting on it. So we'll talk about how to do that. The quality is definitely better than painting on any type of drawing paper. You can't really paint with printer paper. Whenever you're painting with watercolor, it just soaks in and bleeds everywhere and rips your paper into shreds. So you do want to invest in a heavier paper. That paper in particular costs about 27 cents a sheet. So the next one that I have is something that I use with students a lot. It's a little more cost effective than the higher quality that I truly like to use myself, but it's about 21 cents a sheet and it is 90 pounds. So it's a little thinner than the multimedia paper, but it does have a little bit more tooth, meaning a little more texture on the top side of it. And what you can see is even without preparing it by stretching it, which is what we'll be going over in this video, the wash is still fairly even. It's not too bad. It's a good student quality paper. This was, both of those are Canson brand. And then my absolute favorite is the Strathmore 140-pound paper. If you notice, it's not as flexible. It's much thicker. It has a really nice tooth. It's cold press. You're able to use it without too much prep. For something small, here's a quick sketch of flowers that it worked really well without actually prepping it and stretching the paper. But it really is beneficial to do this and prep your paper ahead of time, even if you do a whole bunch at once and you kind of have a stockpile so that whenever you're painting, it's just ready for you. This is an example of a quick painting that I was testing out some liquid watercolor with. And this is done on that 90 pound student quality paper. And it has little puddles and I can actually feel where it warped. And there's divots where that paper had just a pool of the water. And so whenever my paints were bleeding together and blending, they didn't exactly stay where I had put them and just blend a little bit. They stretched the entire way across where the area that I painted. So it actually covered up the red stripe that I had there because the other paints were able to just bleed so much and puddle up on that paper. So you can definitely tell a difference between a higher quality paper and the student quality paper. Depending on your level, your ability, and what you're willing to invest, those are sufficient. It's not like that's a bad thing to start out with that, but your level of frustration can be a little higher. A couple supplies that you're going to need are either a tub of water that I have next to me and some towels so that you can blot off the extra water. Or if you don't have a tub of water that's big enough to actually soak your paper into, you can use a spray bottle or just a very large brush that you can create a wash of water on the front and back side with. So I will go through those steps so that you can prepare your paper for your painting. And when you do this, what happens is you're stretching that paper, you're taping it down to a board, and when it dries, as it dries, it tightens up almost like the head of a drum. So that's going to prevent that warping, or what the correct term is, cockling. And whenever you do this, you're going to want to allow an overnight for it to dry. If you really want to get in there pretty quickly, you can paint within about 15 minutes if you're painting on the damp paper. So there's a couple different methods that I'll explain. If you have a container that's large enough to set your paper in it so it will be completely flat as it's soaking, then you don't need to kind of smooth your paper through the water. What you can do is just very gently submerge it, only touching the edges because you don't want the oils on your fingers to be marring it at all. And then you need to determine how long it should be soaking. This is the 90-pound student grade paper, so it should be no more than 3 minutes or so. And if I were doing the higher quality paper that I have, which is 140 pounds, I would go up to 8 to 10 minutes. So I will put the timer on, turn the video off, and come back and show you how to remove the paper and blot it properly. Okay, it's been 3 minutes. I'm going to remove my paper from this bin of water. I grabbed it by the corner, and as you can see then, what's happening is it's able to drip off of the other corner. And I'm going to just kind of shake off any of that excess water, let it drip off of the corner there, and then very carefully, barely touch the paper. I don't want to be putting any oils from my fingers onto it in areas that I'll be painting. And now I have an old towel laying flat in front of me, and the paper's laying on it, and then I'm going to flip another towel over top of it, making sure it's flat. I want to put firm but gentle pressure where I spread my hand across it a couple times so it can blot out all the excess water. Remove that. I can actually see where the water has been soaked into the towel. Again, touching it only on the corners or very edge of the paper. And then I'm going to be adhering it to a board. My board is a piece of scrap plexiglass. I have plexiglass on the tabletop that I'm going to now place my paper. Actually, I'm going to go this way because I want to soak as many pieces as I possibly can overnight so that they are prepped and ready for whenever I begin testing out a bunch of different watercolor techniques. And I'm going to take my painter's tape, and you'll notice because of this being slightly wet, it does kind of stick to the plexiglass to begin with. And I'm going to tape my edges to the plexiglass as evenly as possible. And then I will be letting this dry overnight. As it dries, it's going to contract and make it tighter, which then holds it nice and flat as you're reapplying any moisture from the paint. The sheet of paper that I'm going to adhere to the plexiglass next is the multimedia paper that is just has been kind of swept through the water. It was not soaked for as many minutes, but I swept it through until it became limp and kind of feeling like cloth because it was a little too large for my container. So we'll do that to test it out as well and see what kind of results we'll get. I'm always kind of starting from the middle of my paper, working my way outward since that's a larger piece. And then I'll remove the towel and make sure that the top side is up. And then I'll lay it down on the plexiglass and do the exact same thing that I did with my other one, which is tape it evenly onto my surface. And then we have one other type of paper that needs to soak much longer because it is the higher quality 140-pound paper, and it is going to soak for about 8 minutes or so before I adhere it to this last bit of plexiglass that I have available. What you're seeing here is my third piece of paper, which was soaking for quite a bit more time. It is the 140-pound paper, and what we're going to do now is allow these three pieces to soak, or not soak, but dry overnight so that then we can begin painting and trying out some of the watercolor techniques. We want to really compare how a wash can be applied to them and not pool up or create those puddles, and everything is going to stay flat and taut like the drum head now that it has been soaking. Another technique, if you do not have a container that is sufficient for soaking it, is saturating it with water, where you use a large brush and you want to apply it quickly and gently so that you're not disturbing the fibers. So this is the front or the top side, and that is the side that has more texture. It has tooth. And now I'm flipping it to the back, applying that same amount of water. And then I am going to blot it to soak up anything that is excess. So carefully lift it because it does kind of stick to your surface. So gently and firmly kind of pushing that water out of it. And then I'll dry off my surface so that I can tape it down. If I do this, it is not so fully saturated, and that is why I will be able to paint on it in about 15 minutes. It will be damp, so this is not a method for dry, if you want to paint on a dry surface. This will have a damp surface, but it is good for those who are not willing to wait overnight. So there we go. That's one way. And the second way is to spray it with a spray bottle. So same idea. Saturate the front, flip it, saturate the back, blot it, all the while trying not to touch too much of it. I'm going to kind of drip off the extra, laying it nice and flat. And then I will tape it down just like I did with the other. It's just that by spraying it, I was not disturbing any of the fibers. I did have to look at it pretty closely though to make sure that I was putting it down on in the right direction. So after this takes just a short amount of time to dry, I'll come back to it and we'll be creating a wash to see the effect of both of those methods. I'm going to create a wash on each of these 3 pieces of paper. One says brush, one says spray bottle, one says soak, because that was the method that I used to wet the paper before it was stretched onto this piece of plexiglass. So now I'm going to use a flat brush to create a nice wet surface. I'll use the same color for each one so that when it dries, we'll be able to evaluate how well it's spread. Now I'm just using student grade watercolors for this wash because that is what is most readily available for everyone, and you can see what will happen then with that dried result. So here we go with the paper that had brushed water on it. Now we're going to go with the one that we used a spray bottle to create a nice even wash, hopefully. That one feels slightly drier overall. And then the one that was soaked, and once they all completely dry, we'll be able to evaluate it a bit. Now this one actually seems to have a little bit of pilling going on. I don't know how well you can see it in the video, but there's a few little pieces of fibers that seem to be brushing across the top as I create this wash. I'm going to go in with a slightly darker layer here on one side. So that we can see what it looks like as it becomes a little heavier or more gradually darker and lighter. Uh-oh, I just dripped a drop of water on the brush one, so might have to go back and smooth that one out just a bit. This one is not applying quite as heavily either. No, this is with the 90-pound paper that is just student grade, about 20 cents per sheet of a 9 by 18. So interesting results already, even before it begins to dry. So we'll see. We'll let this dry. I'll blend that last little piece and get a final result later on. I want to show you the difference of the way the washes turned out depending on how you created the wet paper to begin with. You do have to be careful about the tape peeling up. If it's really sticky, it's a good idea to actually kind of make it less sticky by rubbing it or sticking it to your t-shirt. That helps eliminate any of that separating or pulling off the paper. So this one was from the brush. It definitely created the most even tone. And there's only one little place where it peeled up the fiber. The spray bottle did not wet it nearly as much. So when it was being applied, you can actually see the lines from the brush a little bit more. It did not create as even of a wash, but it did allow for a pretty decent value scale or gradation there. And when I soaked the paper, because this is the student grade, it's about 90 pounds, it is pilling up where the fibers are separating from the paper, and it just kind of degraded that paper a little too quickly. Oh, this is not going to cooperate. There we go. So this is my least favorite method for this particular type of paper. If you're using a thinner paper, it's probably best to just brush water over top of it and then start applying the wash. The 3 types of paper that we tested with the soaking method are attached to this board here, and I want to describe the differences now that they are dry. The Canson 98-pound multimedia paper fared the worst. There are quite a few ripples and they're rather large. I would not recommend this paper unless you want to buy a pad of it and just kind of experiment, but if you want true finished pieces of work, then I would definitely invest in quality. Quality over quantity every time. Art materials are one thing that truly does represent that well. The Canson 90-pound watercolor paper did hold up a lot better. So even though it's not as heavy, it's meant to be used with a water media, where the multimedia paper is supposed to be good for watercolor and other drawing mediums that are dry. So this one has a few ripples, but it's not too bad. So if you are just wanting to kind of play around with stuff and not invest in anything too expensive, this one did pretty well. But the 140-pound watercolor cold press, this definitely held up well. It is completely flat. It is much better to invest in quality if you truly think that you're going to be painting a good bit and want to progress with your techniques. What you see on this piece of paper is a big organic shape. I'm going to create a couple more where I'm creating a wash, and then we're going to layer or glaze the paint so that you can see how you can build upon it to get nice dark colors, but you can start off with the lightest colors in certain areas. So for instance, when you're trying to create something called a value scale, you are using one color and then producing all the lights and medium and dark tones that you possibly can within that scale. So I'm creating this abstract design, or perhaps pattern. We'll see what happens as I go. And I'm going to continually build up the color. So this wash is going to sit for a few minutes so that it has some time to dry, and then I'll come back to it. You may notice that depending on where on the paper, it's a little lighter or a little darker because it does ripple. This is the paper that did not stretch as tight as some of the others. One important thing to keep in mind is that in order to create nice layered differences between the values that you're trying to create, you do need some drying time. So I'm going to allow for my other paper to dry, and in the meantime, I will paint on this one where I'm going to create a different type of pattern, and I'll use a different color. I'm still doing a nice light wash so that I can then glaze over top of it. This one is the student grade 90-pound paper, and it's still rippled a bit, so it will have a few puddles, I'm sure, as we're painting, but it should work out a little better than the first paper, which was the 98-pound multimedia paper. So what you'll see is because I created a little wash of just water first, my paint then stays within those lines as I'm spreading it. Do you want to try to get it as even as possible? And this dot had more paint on the brush than the wash over here. If I come back, I can actually spread that a little bit more. And if it's too heavy anywhere, you can always take a paper towel and you can blot it. So if I want to lift my color, I'm not rubbing, I'm just blotting it where I set it down, give it some pressure, and lift up. And that has removed a lot of the color. On the best quality paper, I'm going to create a wash. In fact, I'm going to switch brushes since it's a bit larger. And I will create kind of more of a sky so that I'm blending colors and it resembles perhaps a night sky that I might see outside. So there I created just a bit of that wet wash, and I'm going to add black, but then I'm going to follow up with another color and let it blend. Notice I got a little too much paint right in this area, so if I wet it a bit more, I'm able to spread it more evenly. It's soaked right up into that paper. And that is not a true black. It has a bit of a brown undertone. I'm going to add a dark bluish color to it. and let that blend as it dries for my first layer of this glazing technique. Still looks like there's a stripe, which I can blend out as I increase my layers. As I said before, this has some puddles because the paper is wavy. It's going to continue doing that. There's not a whole lot you can do to prevent that. But as I layer it, what I'm going to do is continually spread a new section of paint. I'm using the same color for this one. And it's pretty watery so that I'm just giving it a little bit more color with each layer. But you'll be able to see the differences. It dried enough though that it's not just instantly bleeding into that first layer. So if you wait just long enough, you're able to create those hard edges or even lines rather than it blending the entire way through. And we'll finish up these last two. Oh, that one's a little wet where that puddle was. So this is what I was talking about, where this one has a nice even edge, and this does on part of it, but where it was still wet, you're able to see how it just bleeds out into the rest of it. And that's definitely what's going to happen over here because it has rippled drastically. That doesn't mean that you can't still create a glazed effect. You may not want that heart edge for everything. I'm going to come back to the 90-pound paper with the blue, and this time I'm going to leave that corner as light as possible and start making a second layer. Let that wash right out to the edge of where my design ended. And you can tell that my paper is bubbling up more as it is getting more and more wet. So you may start seeing the same thing happen to this one. A little too much paint, not enough water. So this time, instead of dipping back into the paint, I just dipped into the water so I can spread what paint was left on my paper for my second coat. And we'll let it dry for a while. In conclusion, I would advise you to spend just a little bit more on the paper. Don't worry about wasting it. That's why you cut it into smaller pieces to practice at first and then build up to those larger paintings. What you're seeing here are the brushed, the spray bottle, and the soaked papers where this was the student grade. And really the one that worked the best is also best for those who are impatient. So you're able to just brush the water on and create those light washes. And then below us, I could go on much smaller into more detail of these shapes, but I'm going to stop here because we'll get into glazing whenever we actually start painting objects that are more recognizable. So I know this is just like a real quick abstract shape that was created to show how whenever you layer, you're able to start off with that lighter wash and keep building up on it. And you have to be patient with it. You have to give each one of these time to dry. And this multimedia paper was not the best for that, because not only did it not dry as quickly, because it's missing something called sizing, which helps the paint sit on top of the paper and then air dry, but it created puddles. So it bled in places I didn't want it to bleed. Now, the other watercolor paper was a little better, and you can see more defined shapes that happened. And then the good quality was able to be spread over evenly. I started off with an extremely light wash and was able to build it up just a little bit more each time, and I still have room to go if I continued with it.